Hi, I'm Alex Howard, and welcome to Conscious 2. And welcome to Sacred Economics with Charles Eisenstein. Hi, Charles.
Hello, Alex.
Thank you for being here.
My pleasure.
It's a bonfire night here in London, so you may hear various fireworks and various explosions in the background, hopefully inspired by kind of what's happening here in the studio. So if you're watching for the first time on Conscious 2, part of what we try to do is create the intimacy and transmission of an in-person event for you guys watching at home. And one of the best ways of doing that is you guys sending in your questions. So please do, underneath the video, you'll see a questions section. Please do post questions. We'd love you to become part of the event. So Charles, you're the author of a number of books, of which Sacred Economics is the one that we're going to talk about today and tonight. Maybe just start off a little bit about how you came to this area. What was kind of on your kind of path? What kind of ignited your interest?
In sacred economics or in money? Yeah.
Well, yeah, and maybe even, I guess even before that, I know you kind of had a kind of spiritual path and a spiritual interest that opened up even before that. So for people that are kind of new to you and your work.
I mean, I think probably many people have the experience that money is kind of unavoidable when you're thinking about what's wrong in the world, what needs to change, how change could happen, what's preventing change from happening. You know, you ask around a little bit, you do a little bit of research, and you get to money. So money was kind of unavoidable for me because I've been, spending I could, with some exaggeration, say my whole adult life trying to understand what's happening here on this earth. And it started with a feeling that I think many people share, that there's something wrong around here, that the world is supposed to be more beautiful than what's been offered to us as normal, that I'm not supposed to hate Monday. Like in school, it was considered quite normal to hate Monday, and in the work world too, and thank God it's Friday. And I just couldn't accept that.
Yeah, and it's amazing how we kind of normalize. It's like there's a kind of story that gets passed down generation to generation that is normal, and that's something that we should just accept.
Well, also it's economically necessary, because we could not, most of the, or maybe, well, I could even say most of the roles and functions that are necessary to keep society as we know it going are not things that people would choose to do of their own volition, of coming from their own passion or their own joy. So therefore, we have to somehow compel them to do it. And if you don't see any alternative to the way society is right now, then I guess that's a good thing. You have to force people to do things they don't want. I mean, that's been true ever since the Industrial Revolution, when most of the jobs in factories were odious. So I guess one of the things I question is, does it have to be that way? And how does that external circumstance mirror something inside?
Was that question always there for you? Or was there a particular moment or kind of series of moments that ignited that?
Yeah. I mean, I guess initially it was this kind of mute feeling of injustice. Just like the injustice of being, locked in a classroom, and it's a beautiful day outside, and why do I have to be there? And why do I have to do these long division problems? And I don't care about the state capitals, and I want to be outside. I want to, but because all of the authority figures who we normally look to understand how to be human and what's normal and what's good and what's bad, all of them are saying that you're supposed to be doing this. So eventually you begin to question yourself. Maybe I'm bad. Maybe it is supposed to be like this and I'm just not adapted to it.
But what interests me especially is that I think a lot of us have those questions as kids,
Yeah.
but a lot of people accept the answers. It's like, you know, we have the questions and they're burning inside of us, and we talk to our teachers, we talk to our parents, and then they give us answers and we go, huh, okay, well, and then we swallow down our own curiosity and our own kind of desire to kind of challenge.
Yeah.
I wonder why.
Well, I was
for
lucky.
you-
I was lucky because I had influences that validated
Right,
my feeling.
right.
For one thing, my father was politically liberal, bordering on radical. So he confirmed my suspicion that there's something really wrong around here. And I came across books that also validated that, politically radical books. And then in my 20s, so that was one level of questioning the orthodox story of the world.
Yes.
The story of the world that says, yeah, there's some problems, but we're working on them.
Right.
We're going to fix them.
Right.
We're going to overcome our material problems with technology and our social problems with social technology. And civilization is getting better and better, and we're going to end up in utopia.
Like we can just grow our way out of the problems.
For
in a
example,
sense. Yeah.
right, we can grow our way out of the debt crisis. You
Right.
know, economic growth is going to start up again soon, and we're going to be back to the good old days. Like this, there's this kind of fundamental faith in the basic integrity of the system.
Yes.
And so that's one level of questioning, you know, to question that on kind of a socio-political or economic level. But then in my early 20s, I had experiences that made me realize that the delusion that contains us, or the mythology that contains us, is much deeper than I had realized, extending not only to political reality, but even to scientific reality. So I had a very powerful psychedelic experience. I was living in Taiwan, and I came into contact with other worldviews that were just so radically different that what they took for granted as real was very different. And because I was immersed in somewhat radical political thinking, for me to take this story, like someone would tell me a ghost story, you know, and in Taiwan, especially back then, you weren't, you know, weird if you saw a ghost. You weren't considered mentally unstable. You know, it was like, oh, that's too bad, you know, that's scary. Maybe you better, you know, hire a Taoist priest to cleanse your space or something like that. But you weren't a social pariah if you had what we would call here paranormal experiences.
Yes.
So the normalcy of it was unfamiliar to me. And then so someone might tell me a story in very matter-of-fact tones, you know, about their encounter with a ghost or their, you know, results from consulting a geomancer or somebody like that. And so I had a choice. How do I deal with this data point that I'm being offered? One choice would be to stand in my existing story of the world and say, well, this is just a superstitious person from a less developed country, and they haven't been scientifically educated, and maybe they're trying to impress the foreigner, and, you know, I would have a way to deal with it.
Yeah, like you protect what's familiar.
That's
in a
right.
sense. Yeah.
Right. And belief systems have an immune system that will
Right.
keep out anomalous data points.
Yes.
And the other choice is to take it at face value, or to accept that maybe my understanding of what's real is deficient. Now, because I'd already rejected political reality as it had been given to me, I recognized that if I just dismiss this person, I'm perpetrating a parallel to economic imperialism or economic colonialism, which would be maybe ontological colonialism or epistemological colonialism, saying, you know, not only does the West know better how to live, not only do we know that you should abandon subsistence agriculture and village life and build factories and move to cities, but also, so we know how better to live than you, and also we know how to know better than you. Like parallel thinking, the same kind of colonial dismissal of the viewpoints that we would categorize as less developed. It was the same thing, and so I questioned my tendency to do that.
And was that at the time, was that frightening? Was it exciting?
It was exhilarating.
Right.
Because I never really was very happy with reality as it had been presented to me.
You were up for changing and questioning it in a sense.
Yeah. I was like, yes. And it was a matter of, do I dare believe it?
Right.
Because once I began to accept that reality didn't work the way I thought it did, that, for example, everything I do will somehow come back to me.
Yes.
That is a pretty strong invitation to change the way I live.
Right. Right.
And that's the part that's scary. That's the part that's scary because, for example, and maybe we'll talk about gift a little bit, but if you believe that you are a separate self in a world of other, if you believe that unless someone's actually watching, no one's watching, that your actions won't necessarily have consequences, and if they do, you can protect yourself from those. Like if you believe that, then to live in generosity, in gift, that is insane. It's irrational. It's self-sacrificing. Like, I better protect myself.
Right.
Because there is no intelligence in the universe outside myself to look out for me. So there's this struggle between selfishness and generosity in the worldview of separation, of the separate self.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, and yet that's also a very isolating and a very lonely place to live. And a lot of, I think, the suffering we experience as human beings is that sense of us and self and other, and that sense of separation. And so I know that the foundation for the gift economy and a lot of your work has been a questioning of that concept. And I don't know if you want to kind of open up some of that, because in a sense, it's like one of the things that I notice in my life is the more I open and the more generous I am, yes, that has an impact, and yes, things come from that. But even when it doesn't, something different happens inside of me, you know? And it's like, even in that, I guess you could say, even that concept of self and other, when we act from a place of generosity, there's something in that which inherently is a goodness and inherently feels good. And if you want to kind of open up some of that.
Well, yeah, you know, the return gift, when you give forth, the return gift could take many different forms. It, may not come in the same form as you gave. And, I don't want to, see, I'm hesitant to even say what I just said, because it's tempting to trivialize it. And you follow that logic, and eventually you get to blaming the victim, that those who are indigent, those who are impoverished.
Right.
That's because they haven't been giving enough.
Yeah, you get down some of the sticky law of attraction kind of stuff, where it's right.
And so these kind of spiritual ideologies, this law of attraction kind of stuff, can be a way to deny systemic causes of suffering and misery.
And it can be a way of protecting a kind of, that'll never happen, that bad stuff will never happen to me because I'm, it's a kind of self-defense in a sense.
Yeah. But that realization sits alongside examples of people who are in apparent destitution, but are still tremendously generous.
Right.
And who are somehow taken care of beyond reason, beyond expectation. And then there are the ones who are extremely generous, and for all that we can see, they're not taken care of.
Right.
And we can't just exclude that ideologically.
Yeah, and there can also be a tendency of people to constantly give to others because deep down they're doing it because they're giving to others what they want to give to them, and it's not actually coming from a grounded, balanced place. It's actually a playing out of a kind of pattern, in a sense.
Yeah. I mean, we could talk about really how giving and receiving have to be in balance because we're not the source of our gifts.
Right.
The gifts are not actually coming from us, they're coming through us. So if you give from yourself and not through yourself, eventually you'll be depleted.
Right.
Which is easy for me to say, but I often do find myself getting depleted in various ways. And I could, I'm not actually speaking to you as an authority here.
Sure.
I'm in inquiry about this myself.
Yeah, but I think that's also part of what people have resonated with and connected with about your work, that there's an authenticity and a living kind of inquiry around it, you know. And I think part of the danger of a lot of the kind of institutional structured positions is they're so rigid and they're so embedded. They're so like, this is how it is, this is how it should be. And actually the truth is these issues are just so much more complicated than that. You know, when we were kind of were speaking a little bit earlier, you were saying that, you know, you hadn't spoken on sacred economics for a few years, and you kind of, there's an inquiry around, you know, broadening that beyond just money, for example. And that also felt rich and kind of juicy.
Yeah, because, so Sacred Economics, it's a book I wrote, came out in 2011, and it's basically, there's, I guess, one of the pillars is that money is a story. It's a set of agreements that has taken on reality because we all see it as real. And if these agreements are created by human beings, they can be changed by human beings. And we live right now in a story of money that is causing ecological destruction and you know, social injustice and so on and so forth. And so why aren't we changing the story? Well, that story is part of a larger story that embeds it. And I just mentioned what that story was, the story of separation.
Right.
So the book describes, well, what would an economy look like? What would a money system look like if it were built on a different story?
Right.
On a story, to use Thich Nhat Hanh's word, of interbeing, that understands that we're not separate selves in a universe of other. What would money look like then? And so I draw it out, you know, both kind of on a psychological level, but also on a systems level. You know, what would banking look like? What would taxation look like? I mean, it gets kind of nuts and bolts. But another way to say, what would it be like built on interbeing, is to say, what would it be like built on the spirit of the gift? And this, or the viewpoint of the gift. Like what do you know about the world when you're standing in the perspective of gift? And that has ramifications way beyond economics.
Right.
And it's no accident, I think, that many, perhaps all, from what I know, but let's just say many, indigenous cultures really saw the world through eyes of gift. And it's kind of obvious, actually, that we are living in a world of gift because we didn't earn this planet. It wasn't through our hard efforts that there is water with its incredible properties. It's not through our hard efforts that seeds know how to grow. We didn't have to engineer them.
But we kind of forget that, right? When it's like the way we act is as though, you know, we own a house, therefore we own that piece of land.
Right.
You know, and it's when you look at it through the lens you're kind of offering, it's kind of an insane concept, really.
Right. And partly it's because we've built a civilization on the manipulation and control of nature, which does require effort. And what we understand to be wealth comes in a large part through that. So we've kind of created the image of our own perception. And we've created a world of scarcity. And that's one thing I describe, how money as we know it has scarcity built into it because of the way that it's created. The story of money includes, like any story, it assigns roles to different people, to different institutions. So the story of money includes who gets to create money. And basically, it's created by and I want to say this without an overtone of indignation and blame. Just as a fact, it is created as credit. It's created as interest-bearing loans by banks. And that means, and it's not because they're greedy, or if they are greedy, where does greed come from? Greed is a symptom of scarcity. If we're in an apple orchard with the trees groaning with fruit, then I'm not going to like sit here with my pile of apples, protecting them from everybody else, hoarding them. That would be insane,
Right.
Because the abundance is obvious. So, but if everybody is hoarding their apples and has stripped the trees of the apples, and you're hoarding even more than you need because you're afraid you won't have enough in the future, then you've created scarcity when there actually is none. So that's kind of the way our money system works. So money is created as interest-bearing debt, which means that there's always more debt than there is money. Every pound, every euro, every dollar is put into circulation through some form of lending. And that lending that creates, say, £1 million in some business's bank account is accompanied by a debt of more than £1 million. So there's always more debt than money, which means we're always in competition with each other for never enough. And when we're immersed in that world, no wonder we see life as a struggle to survive.
Right.
No wonder we project that onto biology.
And of course, money becomes the source of so much suffering and so much pain, both on an individual level, but also on a collective societal level as well. You know, and it's the stories and the narratives that get passed down through generations and generations. And when you really start to question and challenge these things, it's, you know, going back to what we were talking about kind of on your journey, it can be both terrifying and exciting at the same time.
Yeah, that's true.
And, you know, and in a sense, potentially, you know, if we really look at, there's something maybe we can come to a little bit later that I wanted to touch on, but if we really adopted these ideas on a global level, like what that would mean for the transitions and for the changes, that it's like people are so embedded in their stories, and there are so many people so deeply embedded in protecting those stories and maintaining that. You know, it when you really start to look at it, it becomes pretty radical in terms of the potential of how it could be, but the journey also to reach that.
The irony, though, is that the people who are embedded in these stories and who are defending these stories don't even themselves really want to be in those stories. I think they probably have that same kind of muted outrage, indignation, and desire to break free that I had, you know, when I was in school, when I was young. It's the story isn't working for anybody. Even the 1%, even the power elite.
I mean, it's interesting. One of the things that I've noticed over the years, I've been in different situations and meeting many different people, and even people which seemingly have huge amounts of wealth rarely actually feel wealthy inside of themselves. It's like, in fact, sometimes the more extreme it gets, the more extreme the story becomes, in a sense, and more extreme the fear becomes around it. Yeah.
If money's a token of scarcity, then it stands to reason that the more of it you have, the more insecure you will feel.
Right.
And this is,
right.
So during the Occupy movement, we were at Occupy Philadelphia, and there was a homeless woman. There were a lot of homeless people there, and there was a homeless woman who received a windfall of $9. Someone had, you know, owed her $9 or whatever, and she got $9. And she had had no food that day, and she had no prospect of receiving any more money tomorrow. So what did she do with her $9? She went and bought food for herself and for another homeless person.
Beautiful.
Who needed the food. So basically, she spent her entire net worth on somebody else when she had no food security herself.
Right.
And I think, so when I consider that, my question is, how can I get some of that? How can I have such an experience of security that I'm willing to spend my entire net worth without any guarantee of it ever coming back on somebody else? Where does that come from? And what would happen? I mean, how many wealthy people do you know who would willingly let go of, even a tiny part of their net worth, and feel safe in doing that?
Right. Part of the trouble is that it becomes people's identity. It's not just about their resources and how much money they've got and their lifestyle. It becomes their identity. It becomes who they know themselves to be. And I think that's terrifying to people when you start to shake the foundations of that.
And it's also a proxy for other things. It's a substitute for other unmet needs.
Mm-hmm.
So, for example, if you're lacking an experience of community in your life, an experience of connection, an experience of intimacy, an experience of challenging your boundaries, then you can buy substitutes for those things.
Right.
So consumption can be a substitute for intimacy.
Yes.
Fast sports cars can be a substitute for real adventure. And big bank accounts and lots of investments can be a substitute for real security, which comes from the feeling of being at home in the universe, the feeling of belonging. And we live in a society where we don't feel at home. We don't feel like we belong. We're kind of aliens here, partly because we've built a society where we're surrounded by strangers, strange faces, and not only strange people, but we don't even know the names of the birds and the names of the trees and what medicine they could be used for. And even the created objects, the made objects, these are more or less always standardized commodities. So we lack that experience of intimacy, so we feel alienated, not at home. And that homeless person maybe didn't have that experience of alienation so much. And especially people in less developed countries. And I hate to use the word less developed.
Right. Depends how you define developed, yeah.
Yeah, it implies that we are more developed and that they will one day be like us and should be like us. But people in less developed countries, they tend to be very, very generous, and don't hesitate in. I mean, it's sometimes shocking almost how generous they are, and I think it's because they have that feeling of belonging. They're embedded in villages in a social matrix that is intimate. The people around them know their story, and they know their story, and they know their parents and their grandparents, and every plant, they know what it's used for and what it smells like, and they know the habits of the animals around them and the smell of the soil and the name of that hill and that stream. Like, they're embedded, and and perhaps also they're embedded in a lineage, in a history, yes, in a culture that's continuous. So modernization has stripped all of that away from us. So we feel alone and insecure. And then where do you get security? When true security is gone, then the nearest and best substitute that's available to us mostly is money, which gives kind of at least, a temporary experience of I'm okay. I'm financially secure. I can pay for anything I need to. And but what if the stock market crashes? How much money do you need to compensate for the loss of that feeling of being at home in the universe?
Yes. And of course, the majority of people never even get to that place of surplus. But that what they're doing is they're chasing the idea of, if I got to that place, that's how I would then feel.
Right.
So it's a kind of idealization attachment of this destination that they're kind of.
But you can never even get there.
Right. No, I get it.
I'd like to cite this. There was a study at Boston College that interviewed. I've told this story a number of times. I hope that not too many people have heard it already, but there was a study at Boston College in which they interviewed wealthy people. To even participate in the study, you had to have $25 million net worth, and the average was 78 million. One of the questions they asked in this wealth study was, do you have financial security? The majority said no.
It's kind of insane, right?
How much would you have to have financial security? The average response was, to name a figure, 25% more than they already had.
Huh.
Now, if $78 million isn't enough, it's pretty obvious that no amount is enough.
Right.
And this is an observation that was made over 2,000 years ago by Aristophanes, who was in ancient Greece. Said this was just the time when Greek society was becoming highly monetized. And he puzzled about it.
Yes.
He said, money is not like any other thing of food, wine, sex. A person reaches satiation,
right.
and they no longer desire more.
You certainly hope so, right?
Yeah. But money's different.
Right.
The man who has 40 drachma wants 60, and the man who has
Right.
60 wants 100. There seems to be no amount that's enough.
Well, I think part of what, and I want to in a moment bring in our in-person audience, but one of the things that also I notice happens, and I can name it in myself as well, is the more money we earn, the more we get used to a certain lifestyle, therefore the more we pursue. And I remember, I grew up in I wouldn't say, it depends how you define poor, but not particularly wealthy, let's say, family. And, we never went out to restaurants, for example. I remember going to a pizza restaurant, a friend of mine's birthday, and oh my God, like in a restaurant, it's the most amazing thing. And then in my kind of 20s, and I kind of, left home and kind of did reasonably well and started going to restaurants. I was like, oh my God. And then I noticed over the years, it was suddenly the standard started to rise. And then a restaurant that I would have gone to, oh my God, I'm in a restaurant. I'd be like, what? And it's just, but where does that end? And it's like, and actually what was interesting, I noticed I got to a point that the fancier the restaurants got, the less actual food you got. And it was like, the less you could relax. And there was kind of like a kind of point where actually it was like, this is actually not a better experience. But it's interesting, it always seems like it's relative, like what we compare it against, and it's like pretty much, basically anyone that lives in the Western world, if you measure it economically, is unbelievably, insanely wealthy compared to people in certain other countries. It's right. Extraordinary how we get there, we move the goalposts, we get there, and it just seems to, and that seems to be the sense of, going back to what we were touching on earlier, and I know which is kind of part of the kind of broader kind of theory here, that the idea that growth will solve the problem, that if we get more, it'll be enough. If we grow to there, it'll solve the environmental crisis, it'll solve the kind of economic crisis. Yeah. But it's just it's an illusion, the whole thing, right?
Well, growth only is a coherent concept if you're talking about something quantifiable.
Right.
So we have tremendous growth in everything quantifiable, in square feet of living space, in BTUs of energy consumed per capita. Like we have, economic growth is by definition the growth of something quantifiable. It's the growth in goods and services exchanged for money. But at the same time as we have, the growth in, megabytes of data used per person. We have all this quantitative growth, but it comes at the cost of the qualitative that can't be measured. So, how much money does it take to compensate for the loss of intimacy and connection? Right. How much downloaded music, digitally encoded music, can make up for the loss of singing as part of daily life? if you go to less developed parts of the world, people sing more. Even when I was a child, people sang more than they do today. And I hear that it's true here too, like in the pubs, people don't sing as much as they used to. So
it depends how you define singing, I guess.
well, but I mean, the difference between listening to recorded music and being serenaded by a lover, or being at an awesome concert where they're actually singing to you.
Totally.
And so we're getting, we're getting more and more of the quantitative and less
it's interesting. One of the things that's actually I've noticed it's really sad about live music over recent years is because people are so less used to hearing live music that a lot of bigger kind of bands or artists, they sound more and more like the recorded version rather than the actual what one of the things that's most beautiful about live music is when it's not a perfect production of an album. Like it kind of, they ad lib and they go off and stuff happens.
And they're interacting with the audience.
That's the magic, right?
Yeah.
When the whole thing's played to a kind of video production, a click track, it's like, why bother? It's...
Right, or if they're just kind of going through the motions, going through their performance, and it could be any audience out there, or it could be no audience out there because they're doing the same as the studio version. Then you're like, well, why am I even here? I could be just watching it on YouTube.
Right.
And so what feeds me, what nourishes me is when there's a connection with the band, between the band and the audience, and it's like, oh, they're playing to me. And so there's something unique in that because it's a relationship. They're playing to me, and no amount of money can buy that.
Right.
And when you go to a concert like that, you realize that you've received a gift.
Yeah.
No matter how much you paid for the ticket, you've received something sacred.
Yeah.
That's beyond price.
Right.
And so you become their fan, and you would do almost anything for them.
Right.
You feel, no matter how much you paid, you feel like in their,
Yeah.
you feel gratitude. Yeah.
Well, talking of audiences, we have a little in-person audience here. I want to welcome you guys.
Hi.
We've a little avoided, we got held up in traffic, so we kind of avoided cutting to the audience shot until you guys arrived. But thank you guys very much.
Now we have a
for being
more
here.
impressively sized audience.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly right. It's grown. So thank you guys very much for being here. It's really great to have you. And in a sense, just like as Charles was just talking about, in a sense, it's part of what brings alive the discussion. So I want to really invite you guys to, ask questions and respond, and also to remind people watching at home, if you want to send in questions or you want to post them below the video in the comment section. In a minute, I'll pop backstage, I guess it is, and look for some of the questions that are there, and I'll come out a little bit later and ask them of Charles as well. So yeah, I'll let you guys kind of bring in with questions and stuff that you've got.
So we have Stefana and Rita, and what's your name? Steve. Nice to meet you. Yeah. Yeah, what's on your mind?
And remind you guys to use a mic as well.
Recently I was really privileged to be in the company of a really wonderful, special being who is an indigenous man who was part of the Lakota tradition in Dakota in North America. And I was listening to him talk, and he kind of shared this worldview that the indigenous people kind of hold, which just really blew my mind and just kind of expanded my consciousness. And he spoke a lot about language, actually, and how so much of the story is encoded in our language, which of course is related to the way that we think and therefore the way we are in the world. But something in particular that he said, and this might be skipping ahead a little bit because it's perhaps more related to sort of the transition to the new story maybe. Something that he said that really, really blew me away was in a conversation about what can we do or what is our role. He kind of repeated several times that actually that Mother Earth will save us, and that just really turned around. It kind of really shook up a lot of things inside me, like just the fact that it wasn't human-centered in a way, and it wasn't even a problem-solving exercise of like, okay, here's like, which is often how I feel when I'm, dealing with some of these issues. I kind of am quite thinking of it from, I guess, a human-centric point of view. So he just really, he really sort of turned that around and just said, no, actually, like, it's Mother Earth that will save us. And so where does that leave us in the picture, and where does that leave our role? I just wondered if you had any comments about that, because I think it really, it feels to me, I mean, so much of his talk was taking me out of the grips of this story, to the extent that I didn't even realize how much it was within me, even though I really feel like I try and be conscious about it. So
right,
it's just something I wanted to share.
Yeah, I think very often, what should I do, or what can we do, what should we do, is the wrong question, because the menu of options and our whole conception of doing and of action is subtly, or sometimes not so subtly, conditioned by the old story, the story of separation, and the theory of change that underlies it. The theory of change essentially being, change happens in the world when you exert a force on a mass. So for something new to happen, it's not going to happen by itself. We're going to have to make it happen. And if we don't somehow interfere, if we don't force something toward a purpose, toward a destination, then it will not go toward any destination, because the universe outside of ourselves lacks the qualities of a self, lacks intelligence, lacks consciousness, lacks purpose. It doesn't have any of those things. It's just a random jumble of forces and masses. So in that worldview, we have to make something happen. And so we apply technologies of force in every realm, in medicine, in education, in politics, in every realm. And what we get is merely a different permutation of what we already have. So what is necessary then? If all of our doing, and I'm exaggerating a bit here, okay? But if a lot of our doing, a lot of our action, a lot of our reaction, a lot of our ways of tackling problems are just creating more of the same, then what we need is a phase of not doing anything, of dehabituating from our normal responses. And I'm seeing examples of this all the time, you know? So for example, let's take a big one, climate change. If we agree that, I'm not even sure I want to go into this. So we approach the problem through the usual technologies of measuring the causal agent, which we believe is greenhouse gases. And the solution, therefore, would be to reduce greenhouse gases. And that's something we're comfortable with. Taking a measurable quantity and trying to increase it or decrease it. That's what we do with money, after all. So we can apply kind of the same quantitative logic and problem-solving techniques to that as we do to everything else. But what happens is often the contrary of what we want to happen. So I'm thinking of hydroelectric projects in India that under the banner of renewable energy and reducing carbon emissions, they build these big dams, flood out 1,000-year-old villages and pristine ecosystems, and thereby we're replacing 6 coal-fired power plants, and the numbers are going down, at least in theory. But what is happening, it kind of backfires. What happens is all the people in those villages who had lived very low carbon lifestyles, subsistence farming, they move to cities, they join the machine, they increase the demand for electricity, new coal-powered plants are built to service that demand. Meanwhile, that kind of result comes because we're stuck in the same problem-solving mindsets that are part of the problem to begin with. And really where the Lakota man, I think, is, or one of the things that is informing his advice, is to say, Gaia has brought us here for a reason and put us in this circumstance for a reason. We think that it's all up to us because we don't understand that there is an intelligence in all things. And the way I see it, I don't know, I could say a lot more about it. Should I say a little bit more? Yeah, okay. Really, humanity, or the dominant civilization, is going through an initiation into the adulthood of our species or our civilization. And that initiation shares the features of a lot of traditional initiatory practices into adulthood. For example, I can't remember the name of the author who lays out 5 almost universal features of initiations. One of them is, oh my God, I'm going to die. Like, we're going through that on a cultural level. Another thing that happens is that in a real initiation, your identity is shattered. You're put in a situation for which you have your familiar reference points are taken away, either through isolation or psychedelic plants or physical pain or something, danger, and so your ordinary reference points are gone, and who you thought you were and the way that you interfaced with the world, the way you engaged reality no longer works. So there's a breakdown of identity which is necessary for a new adult identity to form. So humanity is going through that too. Like, we thought we knew who we were. We thought we know how reality worked, and it's not working anymore. The golden promise of technology to engineer a perfect world, and social technology to engineer a perfect society. I mean, in the 50s and 60s, we thought the future was going to be awesome. And we were going to engineer suffering out of existence. We would have, synthetic food and infinite lifespans and, robot servants and space, like all that stuff. And we would certainly engineer poverty and crime out of existence. Like, that future is so far behind schedule now that we're thinking that it isn't going to come. And so our identity came from that, and our belief in the rightness of our civilization came from that. So we're going through an initiatory ordeal. And these ordeals are, when they're constructed well, they're constructed so at a certain point it looks like you're not going to make it. But actually they're not constructed to be impossible. And I think that whatever intelligence has brought humanity onto this earth and given us the gifts that we have knows what it's doing, which is not a guarantee that we will make it through. This is not, my concern at that man's words is that it would encourage kind of detachment and passivity. But, so it's not that it's like a baby being born. The baby thinks, how am I going to make it out? This is really hard. What do I do? What should I do? If you have a conversation with a baby being born, it's asking you, what should I do? What can I do? This is a crisis. I might not make it, And you're like, you know what? Actually, the mother is doing the work. You are doing almost none of the work. Yet. It's easier to give birth to a live baby than to a stillborn. So the responses of the baby to what's happening to it are important. They are part of the birth process too. That's why I'm not saying just don't do anything, but maybe let go of our habits of doing, because a lot of those are part of the problem. But our heartfelt responses to things are necessary.
didn't have anything specific to say. I don't know, the only thing that's kind of in my mind, but it's not really a question, it's just kind of a thought that has been triggered by the conversation. It's I'm reading a book at the moment called Sapiens, maybe you've heard of it.
No.
It takes a really meta view at who are we, at the history of humanity, tracing it back all the way to how did we come to be the dominant human species on the planet when there was actually several human species, and how did we migrate, and tracing kind of the cognitive revolution, agricultural revolution, then industrial revolution. And it's absolutely fascinating. And I'm only kind of maybe a third through, but one of the things that he just started talking about in the transition to the agricultural revolution was about what he calls the luxury trap. And it's that same phenomenon that we were just talking about, that as soon, you have maybe this tiny improvement on your life and you get used to it, and you can't go, as soon as you become used to it, it becomes so much harder to go back. And looking at it from this meta perspective over thousands and thousands of years, he compares the situation. He's like, actually, life as a hunter-gatherer nomad was pretty good.
Yeah.
And life when we made that transition into the agricultural revolution, which is this like founding myth of our civilization that led us to all this progress, but actually our bodies weren't made to plow the land, and our bodies were made to climb trees and to run around. And it's not really, it's just a comment that I found really interesting. He says, bit by bit, we keep doing these things that seemed like improvements, but actually when you look at it, where it went and where it led us, is lives haven't necessarily gotten better. And just to see how that's being perpetuated over and over again, and how with all of those revolutions came these mass extinctions of megafauna. And at this current moment, the only ones that hadn't been touched were the oceans. But now we're in the industrial revolution. Well, that's past, and even that I don't know, it's just, but that kind of, I don't know where the book will take me, but that leaves me to think like, we've been doing this for a really long time. Like, this has been so, I don't know. Well.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it was Hafiz or one of these Sufis who said, comfort enters the house as a guest, but soon becomes the master. Yeah. Something like that. Yeah. Totally.
I guess my question coming out of that, I don't know if the book will lead to any kind of hopeful conclusions, but it's that question. Can we seeing that we've had these patterns for so many thousands of years, is that feeling of like, is this part, are we really going to be able to shift course?
Right. So I've kind of traced this history back as well. And one thing, originally when I started asking what's wrong around here, I identified a series of culprits, each one a bit more fundamental than the last, but then became, with each one realized that it too rested on something deeper. So one of the easily identifiable culprits is, industry, because it's pretty obvious that it's industrial technology that is harming the planet the most. But industry was a natural outgrowth of the original machine, which was composed of human beings that arose in the in the early builder societies, in the early or mid-agricultural revolution, where society became division of labor arose, and society itself became like a machine where each part had a specific function, and that kind of formed the conceptual basis, as well as the surplus necessary for specialization of labor and so on and so forth, right? The agricultural surplus allowed. Okay, long story, but the point is that we can't just identify industry as the problem because it was a natural outgrowth of agriculture. Well, so maybe agriculture is the problem. And there are indeed some thinkers who say that. Well, agriculture, again, wasn't like a sudden thing that happened by accident somewhere, that someone made a dumb mistake and began domesticating and conquering other beings. It perhaps rested on a earlier foundation, which would be conceptual language, representational language, where you are domesticating the world conceptually, reducing its infinity into a finite set of categories. And in the Bible, you see, what did Adam do to establish dominion over the animals? He named them. So, and some people argue, John Zerzan, for example, like once you have representational language with nouns and categories, all the rest of it is inevitable. And that is the mistake. We should undo that. But guess what? Trace it back further. I mean, that mastery and domination of nature goes back to fire, which created the first distinction between the domestic and the wild, and gave us a power that no other animal had, and changed our physiology. Our jaw muscles shrank, our digestive system changed. Maybe fire was the original sin, and we should undo that. Well, then you can go back to stone tools, where we artificially increased the carrying capacity of the land, et cetera, et cetera. And like kind of jokingly in The Ascent of Humanity, which is another book I wrote, I trace it, I say, maybe the eukaryotic cell was the original tyrant. And so, but the point here is that if the wrongness goes so deep, then maybe it's not a wrongness, maybe it's part of a larger process, a process of separation, a journey, of separation that reaches its extreme and then gives birth to reunion, but a reunion that is enriched by the journey. So that's kind of I'm not sure if that's a big comfort when it looks like all of civilization is horrible and wrong, but there's part of me that's just like, it can't be an accident. Like there's so much beauty that's come along with the horror that like, I just feel like this was supposed to happen, and then I think, well, what would civilization look like if we dedicated ourselves to beauty rather than to more? Yeah.
Love the question. I just it reminded me of something that this Lakota guy said as well. He said that in their culture they can go a whole day without using a noun.
Yeah.
Without ever using a noun, and I was just like, wow, like just to never objectify something and like name it, but to always be in relation to it.
Yeah.
It just reminded me, I don't know, this language issue seems to be coming up quite strongly at the moment, and just, and I guess I just wonder, sort of standing in this story of reunion, what would we need to evolve a new kind of language for ourselves somehow?
David Bohm, the physicist David Bohm, actually proposed this, the Rio mode, he called it, a language without nouns, where you are not a woman, you are maybe the universe womaning, because to say that you are a woman implies that you are in some way identical to everyone else who I call a woman. And so David Bohm was coming, as a quantum physicist and a very profound, like a giant of the field. He was basically coming from, I think, the recognition that objects don't have an independent existence. And nouns kind of imply that they do. But existence is relational. That was where he was coming from. Existence is relational. Something only comes into a fixity of existence when you measure it, when you interact with it in some way. And if you don't, then it is in multiple places at the same time. It is in a superposition of states. So if being is a matter of relationship and not an objective, independent, observer-independent fixity of being, then our language, which implies the opposite, needs to evolve. So that's like, I don't know, I don't want to get like too hyper intellectual, but I think that part of the crisis of language is coming from this growing recognition that reality is relational. Like, well, I just said, like, our language is peppered with likes a lot. And then the other one is So, because nothing is anything, it's like something, and I can't say exactly what it is, but like, so I think that this much criticized degeneration of speech actually has some wisdom in it.
That I'm just gonna riff on this tangent. It's just that I think the kind of field in which I encounter where people talk a lot about language and how to use language is actually in the kind of transformation of genders and masculinity, femininity, and it comes up a lot in that. And I also know that you're obviously embarking on a whole project around masculinity, so I was just wondering if you can say something.
Right. So this is really provocative, like some people get really upset when I even use the word masculinity, as if it is something, and not just a cultural construct. And by even talking about it, I'm perpetuating a cultural construct that has no essential reality to it. It's just a story. I hesitate, though, to say anything is just a story, because maybe everything is a story. Maybe the elements of reality are not particles, but are stories or information. Again, that's something that's not so different from quantum reality. So yeah, my inquiry about masculinity, femininity, isn't what is the culturally independent essence of it, but what is the next story that we want to move into? Because the story I grew up in of what it is to be masculine, like that isn't working. It hasn't been working for a long time. That you're tough and you don't feel emotions and you never cry and like that whole thing, it doesn't work. So kind of seems like there was a whole generation that was like, well, I'm just not going to be masculine. I'm going to get in touch with my inner feminine, and like that's good. But many people I talk to, many men I talk to, we want something else. We want to embrace masculinity, and a lot of women want that for in the men that they deal with too. They don't want the brutal patriarchal male, but they don't want someone who's pretending not to be male either. So, and this comes down to actually a really, like, this is my problem with postmodern thinking, which says everything, it agrees everything is a story, everything is a text, everything is a construct, but it assumes that everything is a human construct and that stories are the creations of human beings. But I'm sure that Lakota man would not say that humans are the originators of stories. You ask, where did you get your stories? They were given to us, and here we are back to the gift. They have an existence that is beyond human beings. Same with these archetypes of, say, masculinity, femininity. They are channeled through human beings and through culture, and they take on a different form. But that doesn't mean that they are creations of culture. And so I think this is the essence of the transition, of the shift in consciousness that we're going through today. It's a return to, you could say, animistic thinking, panpsychic thinking. You could say that it's the final stage of the Copernican revolution that no longer puts human beings at the center, but holds us in a world that is alive. From the macro, the cosmos is alive, the planet is alive, Gaia, alive, not just as if it were alive, but actually alive and intelligent. And all the way down to every atom is alive, every electron is alive. it makes choices. And even things that we don't, stories are alive. Stories have a consciousness. So how do you tell a story well? You have to be in relationship to it. You have to know it. You have to be intimate with it, and you serve it. And stories are like other beings. They change over time too, some of them. So anyway, it's a completely different way of seeing the world. And I don't think that we're going to get through this crisis with a revolution that is not that deep. The revolution has to go all the way to that level. Otherwise, we are going to continually recreate different versions of what we already have. The revolution is that we are no longer alone in the universe, no longer aliens in a dead world of force and mass. And when we see the world that way, then we have to and want to treat it as with respect. You can talk about respecting nature, but if you fundamentally believe that nature is just a bunch of randomly colliding generic particles, then respecting nature, that's kind of like a poetic trope, but it's not, there's nothing to actually respect. Like, should I respect this glass the same way I respect you? I only respect you to the extent that I see you as a full being. And in fact, when we lived in a patriarchal ideology that saw you as less than a full being, kind of, half a subject, but not a full subject, then you got treated that way. And as we men understand that you are a full being, we treat you as such, and that probably feels pretty nice. But so to really respect nature requires a shift in perspective, in perception, to see nature as an agent, as a being, and everything in nature. Even this glass, actually. And if you ask a child, what is it like to be the water in this glass? That's not an absurd question. And if you ask an indigenous person that question, it probably will not be taken as an absurd question. The child or the indigenous person might say, well, I don't know. Or he might say, let me communicate, let me ask. Maybe they have a way of asking. There are so many technologies that we do not recognize as technologies or modes of interaction that are invisible to us because we are so conditioned to see this as a random jumble of H2O molecules. But once you begin seeing it as a being that is having an experience, then only then do you even seek to find ways to ask. And people, are relearning some of these. How do you ask the land what it wants? How do you ask the soil? How do you ask the water? When we have access to that way of knowing, then we will be able to carry out the necessary healing that has to happen on this planet. Without that, it's impossible. We're doomed. Given what and a lot of people, when they investigate like just how bad the ecological crisis is, they fall into despair because according to what is possible in the old story, it is impossible. Even not to mention technologically impossible, politically impossible. How do you get enough people to change their mind fast enough? When all of the money and all of the guns and all of the media and all of the power are in service to perpetuating the status quo. An impossible task.
You started speaking about the end of patriarchy, I suppose, and seeing that as something that we're on the cusp of, and then you went into speaking about oneness and seeing everything as being a part of a whole. Do you see that there's a link in the sort of realization of the new man, seeing women as equal beings, as helping us to achieve that jump towards this vision of oneness.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think it's impossible to fully inhabit sacred masculinity without, full equal partnership with the feminine principle. It doesn't necessarily have to be a man and a woman to engage in that partnership. Probably it could be a man and a man, another man who's occupying, or, in his feminine aspect, or, maybe even, I don't know, there's probably other ways to do it, but I think it's like any other polarity. The fulfillment of one requires the other. And like, okay, maybe you were talking about oneness, one of the conceits of the story of separation, when translated into spirituality, is that spiritual development is something that you can essentially self-source, that you can accomplish. Enlightenment is something that you can work hard to achieve. And therefore that this is an implication that's usually not stated, but some people are trying harder than others. Therefore, some people are more accomplished in their spirituality than others. And if spirituality is the epitome of virtue and the most important, overridingly important accomplishment, then you're better than other people. And so there's this kind of elitism, self-righteousness, that is quite obnoxious among certain groups that identify themselves as mindful, conscious, spiritual, and so on. But I think that, for one thing, we're understanding more and more that anybody who we judge in that way as being less conscious is a mirror of something in ourselves, because we're not separate beings. And that, therefore, this actually ties back to the gift. What if spiritual progress, if such a thing even exists, what if that isn't something that you can achieve through your efforts? In my experience, it isn't. I receive it as a gift. Something happens. Something happens to me. That it could be a realization, it could be an experience that shows me something about myself, about what's possible. And in that moment, I'm blown away. Like, I know that I never could have come up with that. And I'm like the baby being born. It's not that and again, this isn't a prescription to not make efforts, to not seek knowledge, to not do practices. But it's that the real progress, the most important progress, comes through letting go and through humility. But even those are not something you can do. Then it's like, okay, so what's my assignment now? Humility. Okay, I'm going to try for that. Letting go, surrender. I'm going to try really hard to surrender. That's not how it happens. How it happens is, I'll use first person. I hold on as tightly as possible, and I try hard not to surrender until I am overcome, and I have no choice but to surrender. So you can't make it into a formula or a recipe. And this is, again, resonant with what the Lakota man told you. And to me, this is both scary and a huge relief. Like, it's not up to me. I don't have to figure it out. I don't have to know what to do. But it's also scary because it's not under my control. I'm helpless.
Something I was just thinking about is when we were talking about masculinity just now, you were saying how it has to go that deep, like any less won't be enough. And earlier you were talking about the kind of initiation rites and how you need to completely shatter your identity and everything you kind of held on to, your kind of the structure of your reality. And that really resonated with me on a very profound level because, as you know, I lost my mother earlier this year, and it's this profound, the experience really, apart obviously the pain and the loss, but there was this profound experience of feeling like everything that I thought how reality was and how my life was actually really like, wait, just everything shifted completely. And it, even though it was so painful, it's also been so enriching and empowering, and and just being able like, okay, I actually get another puzzle. And there's, when you talked about surrender, that's what I was saying, there's a huge part of reaching that point of actually really being in that space of, you know what, I don't know. I don't know what this life is about, what existence is about, where my mom went, where I'm going to, like just really being in that feeling. And then from that place, just letting go and being like, I'm just going to swim in the soup of cosmic whatever. And I guess my question is more so, aside, in addition to kind of exploring what can be the new masculinity or what that means of the new story, maybe also thinking about what place death and grief hold in our society. I know you've talked a lot about that. I'm just thinking of what are kind of maybe the key elements that go to the core of what do we need to work on, what do we need to shift, and where do we need to create space in our society to move us into that new story? Because obviously we can talk about changing food systems and the economic system, but it's like the underlying things.
Yeah.
So, I don't know if
Yeah.
some others.
Yeah, I mean, thank you for mentioning grief, that what has happened on this planet is really, really sad. And it should hurt to apprehend it. So we have all kinds of ways to keep the pain at a distance. But that effort to keep it at a distance comes at a cost. It comes at a cost of seeing the truth, seeing what's real and what's true. And if we are operating under a delusion, we're not going to be able to accomplish anything of value. So there's, one of the most positive things that's happening today, I find in the United States, is that like certain kinds of hidden trauma are coming to the surface to be witnessed and seen. For example, police brutality, and various expressions of racism, that they've always been there, but now thanks to social media and ubiquitous cell phones, now what was once hidden is coming to the surface. And when it comes to the surface, you can try to push it away with, it's like the right wing kind of finds ways to deny that it's happening, or you can take it in and go through a process. Maybe pushing it away is part of the process, denial, right? And then each piece that comes back together through the passage of grief that makes us more whole. Like grief is a way of gathering our lost parts and becoming more whole and therefore more powerful, happier. I recently did a podcast with Francis Weller. We talked about that a lot. Yeah, he was. There's some people doing amazing work. Joanna Macy, of course, is another one. Malidoma Some, that's who Francis Weller studied with. And again, this is not something you can go home and do. One of the characteristics of the expression of grief in other cultures is that it was public. It was witnessed. You were held in your grief by others, not just crying on your pillow. Yeah. Crying on your pillow, you can do that for years and never get to the bottom of it.
Yeah, I felt that really strongly, that feeling of there's just no space, we don't make space in our society to grieve, it's like just that thing of, let's just push it under the carpet. And, you get your 2 weeks of compassionate leave and then back
Right.
to work.
Yeah.
It's like, wow, this huge thing, this huge grief, and we just don't know how to,
And to take it back to the idea of hunter-gatherers and whether they had a richer or poorer life, like they had vast amounts of time. Hurrying was not part of their lives.
Yeah.
And grief has its own rhythm, its own timing. Sometimes it might be 2 weeks, might be enough. Sometimes it might take a year. And that is one of the kinds of wealth that we're so deprived of, the wealth of time. Do you remember as a child having the afternoon stretched on endlessly? Like there is this sense of plenitude, of abundance. Like time, you had all the time in the world. Like when was the last time you experienced that? This is a fundamental form of wealth, to experience life as abundant, because time is life. Your time is your life. And to experience life as endless, as abundant, that is about as primal a kind of wealth as one can have. Animals have it. You just I have so many memories of this. I was at a festival, speaking at a festival, and there were these monkeys that were hanging out at the festival, up in the trees, looking for opportunities to steal food, I suppose. But just looking up there, they were just hanging out on these branches, lolling around for hours and hours and hours and hours. They had, and the birds around there, they were just pouring forth their song. And it seemed just for the joy of it. And I could say, well, they're marking territory, they're competing for mates, and so, yeah, maybe. But it didn't sound that way to me. It didn't sound like they had to sing that much. It sounded like they were singing to each other and to me, and that their life was rich, and that they had leisure. And my life is busy, and I have this kind of omnipresent voice that says, you have to be efficient. There's not enough time. There's so much you could be doing. And if you waste time, then you won't have enough time to do the things you have to do. And it's kind of like, even if I have nothing in front of me to do, it's still this kind of programming that, I'm learning to recognize it and to not pay attention to it. But it's really deep programming. Yeah. I'm wondering if we should maybe take a little break or something. These programs usually have some kind of exercise or meditation or something. But if there's something,
I can keep going. I've got about 10 more questions.
Also, there's questions from perhaps the people watching remotely.
So we're going to go to a break, yeah?
We
I'm
could.
on a 30-second delay on the live stream, so Nick's saying, we're going to a break, and 30 seconds behind. So yeah, let's go to a break. If we take about 10 minutes or so,
Yeah.
and if people at home want to post in, we've got a number of questions already you'll be able to see below the video. There's some great questions there, so we'll perhaps do those after the break. If you want to post any more questions, we'll come back in about 10 minutes, and I'll put some of those questions to Charles, and I'm sure we'll continue to dive into the dialogue.
Yeah, and I would say just I'm not going to give you like any specific exercise or anything for the break, but I would encourage you to stay in a quiet zone and just let a natural digestion process happen. To not distract yourself with anything.
Yeah, if I can add to that as well, it's because of course it's easy for people to get caught in the kind of intellectual kind of questions and stuff that come up, but I think part of what you're inviting is also to stay with their hearts and their bodies in terms of what's provoked and what's triggered by the dialogue.
I would even hesitate to make that an instruction. Yeah.
All right. Yeah. Okay, fine. Good. All right, so we'll see you in about 10 minutes, and please do, as we say, share any questions that you've got.
See
And
you.
you can also share your experiences as well. Okay, so welcome back. And thank you guys for posting questions below the video. As you can probably see, there's quite a few questions and comments. So I'll do my best to pull out the ones that seem like the best fit. A few people have been asking similar things, so I may paraphrase some of the questions as well. And we'll also kind of have a bit more kind of interaction with our in-person audience as well. So firstly, Charles, there's quite a lot of feedback and engagement, which is exciting. I think people feel really alive in what you're talking about. I think, in a sense, where you were kind of starting to build towards, and certainly a few of the questions are exploring, like, how do we move forwards? It's like, you know, I think you've laid out really clearly kind of the challenges, the issues, and kind of poked towards some of the ways that we can deal with the situation. But what are your thoughts on that? Because it can feel like quite a big leap, let's say, from where we are to where the invitation is to go.
Well, the first thing I'll say is how do we move forward? What does that really mean? Who is this we?
Right.
It might mean, for whoever's asking the question, how do I move forwards?
Yes.
We can be kind of theoretical.
Right.
And frustrating, because, in fact, I put this in the introduction to one of my books, that I've become a little tired of, kind of books on policy and stuff, and here's what we should do. We should switch over to renewable energy. We should do this. Well, great, but I'm not we. I'm just me. And merely providing the correct answer as if it would go to teacher and teacher would make the correct decision based on the information. It kind of assumes a faith in the way that decisions are made collectively in our society that is not warranted.
Yes.
So to turn the question to what should I do, like what should we as individuals do? Again, I don't know any better than you do. In fact, I couldn't know better than you do what you should do, because I'm not in the totality of your situation. But I would say then, and I'm not going to say, well, fighting against climate change is more important than getting money out of politics, and less important than the refugee crisis, and more important than ending racism, and less important than having gender-neutral bathrooms. And different people are impassioned and called by different ways by different issues, and not just kind of public issues, but like maybe the most important thing you could be doing is to be at the bedside of your grandmother who is going through the dying process. And that might take a week or a month when you could have been out marching against climate change. And instead, you're just with a person who's going to be dead anyway. So a lot of the logic that we use to kind of weigh options and like, I think some of that is part of the problem. And so really the way I would answer that question is really you already know what to do. Maybe not intellectually, but when you are called by something, you know what that feels like. And if nothing is calling you, instead of living enslaved to this, I've got to be doing something, maybe the time is not to do anything. Just like animals spend a lot of their time doing nothing. In fact, one of my friends, can I tell a little story?
Sure, please do. No, actually, no. Sorry, Charles.
She was in Mali, speaking to a Dogon elder, very traditional tribe, and she said to him, "Don't you feel urgent?" Because he knew, like, he was not oblivious to the things happening on the planet and to his people and to their land, and to his country. And she said, "Don't you feel urgent to do something about this? Don't you feel this urgency? The time is urgent, And he said, "Urgency is not something that we have around here." I thought, is this yet another opportunity for the white man to school the Dogon on how to live life, on how to be human? Or could it be that we have something to learn from them?
Yes.
So, again, I'm not telling anybody don't do anything. But it's to trust your calling and your urge and your desire to respond to something. We don't have to be born by ourselves. We're not the ones doing the birthing, but our responses are important. So I guess I would say to trust your life force, because, and this is not to offer the seemingly small, inconsequential things as an alternative or a substitute for political action, but it's to say that they come from the same place ultimately. That, like, there might be a moment to put your body in front of a tank, or to get out onto the street and confront, the army or something like that. And how do you know when that moment's there? And where do you source the courage to do that? If you condition yourself, if you practice listening to the call of life, then you will have the clarity and courage in those moments. And the commitment, because often it's not just one moment, but it's something that requires commitment over time. And so where does that come from?
That was my next question, because in a sense, some people appear to have that clarity and also have the courage to act upon that clarity. And for others, that doesn't seem to be so easy. And I wonder what either in your life you found has helped make space or support that clarity and that action, or what you've seen in others has helped them with that.
Maybe one thing that's helped, I can't really lay claim to any special degree of courage or clarity. I often run into people who are really courageous, but to the extent that I have some clarity and courage, I think it's because of the community that I'm embedded in, and the people who love me and believe in me, encourage me, who are watching me. It's a lot easier for me to be courageous when I'm being held and witnessed. I think that anything that brings greater trust in the processes of life will help us be sensitive to that call and to distinguish it from the call of our own fear or of our own ego. Anything that puts us more intimately in touch with the processes of life, anything that clears away the fear, anything that gives us an experience of security and belonging, which really almost means that this is not something that you can do for yourself, but it's something you can do for others. If you give somebody an experience of connection, of unconditional love and acceptance, then they'll probably be more able to accept hard truths that might be painful, that might hurt their ego. But like for me, it's a lot easier to acknowledge and confess to something that I've done wrong or that I've ignored if I know that the person calling me out really loves and accepts me. So that's something we can offer each other. I think enlightenment is a group process.
And it's interesting because if we look at more of I will come back to your questions in a second, but if we look at more of how we tend to take on the political side of these challenges, that often what we do is we take a position that I'm right and you're wrong, and here are all the reasons why I'm right and you're wrong, which of course then re-engages a closed position on the other side and doesn't support that kind of opening. But it's difficult when dealing with significant issues that we feel a great deal of passion and intensity around, to communicate that in ways which can be heard.
Right. The paradigm of making the world a better place by conquering evil is common to all political
Right.
ideologies, almost. Left, right, and center. The people who disagree with me disagree because they're either ignorant, stupid, or evil.
Or all three.
Yeah.
Right.
And because they are that, victory will come by overcoming
Right.
their position with force of logic, force of law, force of shame, public opinion, something like that.
Which is the same thing we do in intimate relationships when we get angry at our partner, where these are all the reasons why I'm right, and and
Yeah.
it's the same pattern, I guess.
Right. Yeah. And it's part of what I call the old story. Conquering evil was a concept that was only invented with the rise of large agricultural societies and empires, where evil was associated with chaos and the wild, and good was associated with order and the kingdom. And so the good king extended order into the wild, cut down the forests, and conquered the wild beasts. So that, it's still with us today. We find somebody, we make them evil, and we seek to destroy them. There's U.S. foreign policy in a nutshell.
You're American, you can say it.
Yeah. Well, and here I'm in the land of our junior partner and all this. So.
Well, that's true.
Yeah.
This is true. Yeah. Okay, well, let's come to some more of the questions. It's a question from Lawrence Carson, who says, do you think belief systems beyond the archetypical stories are literally conscious, self-sustaining, living forms of energy fields, are in charge of mankind, or is mankind in charge of the beliefs, and why? And how can this really be changed?
Yeah, yes, I do think that they are living, evolving beings, and probably the relationship is mutual. They create us and we create them.
Right.
And how do we change it? I think it's more of participating in a process of change. Yeah, participating in the process of change. Specifically, we can disrupt existing belief systems and be in service to emerging new stories or belief systems that are recreating who we are. Yeah,
Right.
I hope that's not too vague, but
Yeah, no, I think it's helpful, and I think it kind of leads into another question. And I'm slightly butchering the question and paraphrasing it here, but there's a question on here as well around how do we engage, and we kind of just touched on it in a moment, but perhaps we can explore it a bit more, of how do we engage more people in the dialogue, when there are people around us that are closed, and it's like we feel that we have a broader perspective on truth perhaps than they do, or we feel that there's things that they're not open to seeing that we'd like to open them to. And if we're not going to go in there and kind of make them wrong and make us right and take our position, how do we invite a more open, a more honest inquiry from people?
by shouting louder so that they can hear us.
Okay, good, thank you.
Or if that doesn't work, then by listening more deeply.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, but that's hard. That's a hard thing to do, especially in a world that doesn't seem to encourage that. It tends to encourage more of a kind of driving of perspective, and perhaps maybe the question that I'm after is, what helps us listen more deeply? Or you can answer what supported you in listening more deeply, because often what happens is we go from thinking we have it figured out to questioning to listening, and some of the wiser people I've sat with, what supports their wisdom is actually more listening.
One thing that helps me listen more deeply is when I realize I don't know. If I think I know, then I don't need to listen. If I think I know how to, increase crop yields and have a better agricultural system because I've studied agronomy and I have all the answers, then I'm not going to listen to the land. If I think I know what's best for my wife or my son or my neighbor, then I'm not going to bother listening to that person. So what helps me be a better listener is humiliating experiences that show me that I didn't know very much after all.
Like parenting, for example.
Yeah, humiliating experiences that show me I didn't know so much after all. That helps me be a better listener.
Right. I'm with you.
The other thing is, by example, when I'm really deeply listened to, that invites me into the vibration of listening. So I become a better listener when someone's deeply listening to me.
Nice. There's a few more, people have got some quite specific questions, and I'll put a few of them out, and
why not?
See where we go. So, so there's a question from. This is a question for Gabrielle. On the subject of money and its potential to change stories, what does Charles think about some of the ideas around universal basic income circling around in Northern Europe? Is this a potential change story?
Yeah, Charles is very enthusiastic about universal basic income.
Okay, good.
It would be
and for those that aren't familiar what it is, maybe just say a few words about
basically it's a salary that everybody gets.
Right.
Every year that's enough to cover basic living expenses. And it's not needs-based. Bill Gates gets it too. He gets whatever, Richard Branson, use a UK example, he gets it too, and he can do whatever he wants with his £10,000 a year. And so can, the single mom and everybody else. And so it sounds very radical, and it is very radical. And it brings up a lot of objections. For example, well, then people would just be lazy and they wouldn't work. So if you believe that people only want to work and contribute and create because they're forced to, and if they weren't forced to, that they would sit around, watching the telly all day, eating crisps, but thank goodness they're compelled to contribute to society by fear of starving. If that's what you believe,
right, then
universal basic income is a terrible idea. But if you believe that we are here as creators, and that that's our deep desire, and that in fact economic pressure restricts our creativity and directs it towards things that do not serve our planet and society, then a universal basic income is a very good idea, because it liberates us to do the things that there's no money in today. So if we had a universal basic income, we would have a lot more people taking care of each other, doing meeting these unmet needs in society, and we'd have fewer people doing things that no one would do if they weren't forced to by economic necessity. We'd have a lot fewer people willing to spend 40 hours a week their whole lives cleaning toilets or driving buses or emptying trash bins. So we'd have to design a society that had a lot less of that. Maybe not zero. Maybe everybody should clean some toilets. Or maybe it's okay to do that as a summer job, or at a certain stage of life you want to do something routine. But we'd have to have a lot less of that. So it would fundamentally transform society. So yeah, Charles likes universal basic income.
I'm glad to hear Charles does.
Yeah.
There's a question here on the masculine feminine, and apologies I can't pronounce them. I think it's Kirsty, perhaps. How can we use our masculine and feminine energy to serve this transition from separateness to unity? Some tough questions in here, hey?
Yeah.
And just while Charles is thinking, to say to you guys, if you you can like questions. So if there's particular questions you really want me to ask, you can also feel free to vote up the questions, and I'll let that steer it a little bit as well. Sorry.
Yeah, to answer that question, I'd have to at least maybe describe what I think masculine and feminine energy is.
Right. Which you touched on a little bit earlier, but if you want to.
And I've been conducting interviews or recording conversations, let's say, because I'm going to be running this course. I've been calling it an online course, but it's more of kind of a learning journey called Masculinity, A New Story. So in one of these conversations that I recorded, I spoke with a man, Michael Rice. He's Irish, actually, and just does the most amazing work with men particularly, but also mixed groups. And he draws on kind of, I guess, sacred geometry to understand these principles. So a point at the center of a circle. I'm gonna butcher this. But basically, so associated with, some of this is kind of common sense, not anything new, but so the masculine essence, I guess, in his view would be focus, presence, clarity, and directionality. Whereas the feminine is expansive, in constant flow, the feminine is the circle and the masculine is the point at the center of the circle. It's kind of hard for me to switch gears like this real fast and reconstruct what he said, because we had several hours conversation. But and there was another guy too. Yeah, this question's just a little bit too big for me to. I really can't do it justice. I'm sorry.
That's okay.
Yeah,
that's okay. Yeah. And it's interesting in the kind of the whole concept of masculine and feminine as well, and it was kind of, you guys touched on a bit earlier as well. People can get so emotive and so emotionally charged around it. And I really liked what you were saying around, in a sense, kind of men being men unapologetically, but also I think you were talking about not regressing back to the kind of like, and in a sense,
the masculine energy is supposed to be, its full expression is in service to life.
Right.
And that is only possible through connection to the feminine, which is closer to life.
Right.
So when it becomes detached, then the masculine energy gets, it loses its mooring to reality even.
Right.
And so you get into the world of high finance, and shifting these numbers around, and these kind of techno geeks, who have all of their really heady, these could be women doing this, but it's a masculine energy,
right.
That kind of calculate the correct solution and everything, but it's where you have the drone operator, killing targets as if they were on a video screen with a touch of a button,
right.
But dissociated from life.
Yeah.
So that's why the masculine can only truly be in service to life when it's connected to the feminine, to matter, to materiality. I'm not really doing this justice.
But I think you are, and perhaps one way that I'd be curious to kind of bring it into kind of what we're talking about here is, in a sense, let me put it in a slightly different way. One of the things that I've noticed is that as people go on spiritual paths, let's say, and they start to open their heart and they start to discover they're more than just the kind of ego kind of constructed space. And as part of that, they notice the value of quietness and being with themselves and solitude and spaciousness. And they go from perhaps living this very driven kind of like worldly kind of life to actually really seeing the power and the nourishment of having more time and more space. And they reconstruct their life, in a sense, around that. And that's clearly a progression and a development, if we call it that, for them in their life. But it's also, what I notice is that some of the people that have evolved and expanded the most, that in some ways have the most to offer the world in terms of the complexity and the problems that we have. In a sense, what they're drawn towards, quiet spaciousness and simplicity, and therefore it somehow can be less willing to be engaged with the complexity and the challenge and the kind of the noise that's there in the world. And it just struck me as you were talking that, in a sense, it's the reclaiming of the healthy version of that masculine power, which actually gives the capacity to re-enter and to actually show up for and stand up for the things that really matter, as opposed to kind of standing up for the things that kind of feel like they matter, but really aren't.
Right.
Yes.
Yes.
Does that?
Yeah, that's well put. Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm not going to add to it. Let's
right. Okay. Let's move on. Yeah.
Let's move on.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I don't know if anything. I'm going to go through the questions a little bit more, but anything that feels kind of alive in you guys in what we're talking about here. Remember to use the mic as well. So, sorry.
I don't know, as you're speaking, Charles, I'm reminded of that article you wrote about money and the divine masculine, where you talked about this a lot. And it really, really resonated with me. And in that article, you explained how kind of the abstraction of the money system and particularly, as you spoke about, finance and has, like you said, has become separated from the material reality of relationships and community and the earth and matter, which is maybe more of the feminine realm of existence. And it just made a lot of sense to me.
Yeah, it's the ultimate of abstractions, and it's kind of hijacked the maybe masculine associated urge to accomplish something.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because I also think to some extent this has happened a bit in spirituality with the where, like, I'm really interested at the moment. I'm reading an interesting book about how women's spiritual power is very related to their bodies and their systems, which have the power to create life and which are intrinsically have a connection to the earth. That's it's to do with our bodies, and it's not something separate. It's not even to like call it a feminine power is like abstracting it and saying that it's available to both men and women. But what this author is really emphasizing is that actually that's not doing it justice, because it is related to a woman's body that is distinct from a man's body. And so there's something different about that, and we need to kind of wake up to that reality and honor that. And I hadn't really heard that view on it before, but I thought there was something really interesting about that. I don't know whether you had any thoughts about, I don't know, spirituality and...
Yeah, I mean, spirituality has been masculinized a bit, where the kind of unworldly, unfleshly, transcendent pursuits are privileged over the ones that are of the world, of the flesh, in this messy, complicated reality, and so we seek to create abstract principles, to reduce things to universal laws, all that stuff. I mean, those are not worthless pursuits. They have their place, but our society has valued those above everything else, and money is one manifestation of that. That's the very epitome of the abstract and the non-material. I mean, money is just bits and computers. It's almost nothing. And there's a very close parallel between money and spirituality as it has often been conceived. It's this formless thing that is everywhere and nowhere at the same time. It is the cause of all things. It is the universal end. It's the universal means. All things come from it. All things return to it. Right? Like this whole conception of the spirit. You can say the same thing about money. It can accomplish anything. All things come from it. It makes the world go round. And yeah, I think both of those are kind of these. They're both kind of extreme, distorted versions of patriarchal masculinity, and they need to be reconnected. Just like money needs to be reconnected to ecology, so that the best business decision is also the decision that's in service to the planet. that reconnection needs to happen. And what we call spirituality needs to be reconnected to the body. Yeah. We're getting very, now I feel like I'm getting really heady here. Yeah, talking about the body, but here we are. I mean, we're in this I'm being beamed to distant people.
You are, that's absolutely right, you are.
Yeah. And so this is, again, not to say that this is a waste of time, but also, not a substitute. It's like whatever you're getting from this, to actually make it real and to digest it, to embody it, that probably can't be done online.
Well, I think that's right. It's like being online can inspire ideas and get people enthused, and people may be watching this and think, but in a sense, it's what happens after this, which is really important, right? It's like, what does this actually mean in somebody's life, and how do they use it, and what's the inquiry or the exploration that hopefully is provoked or opened by it? I guess that's where something different gets to happen.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm mindful that there's quite a few questions here, and I think I picked out a few which give us a few different directions to explore. And there are a few people I'm mindful of not going too much down the kind of logical, practical side, but there's a few questions that I think would be interesting to touch on. Greg asks, can you talk about any community or business projects you've been involved with in the US, I guess it could be anywhere else, that are dedicated to help people live intentionally with engagement? Like, are there any actual signposts of organizations or projects or things that you feel are embodiments or kind of inspirations of some of these ideas?
I mean, there's a lot that I've come across that seem to have a piece of it. There's none that I would say that this is the one, So I hesitate to really, endorse one over the others. I'd say that, there's just so many different communities of practice that are bringing us back into relationship, back into our bodies, back into transparency, into honesty, that are restoring our felt connectedness to all beings. And there are, sometimes people go and create whole eco-villages or communities that are dedicated to that, to have a place where it's happening with purity and intensity. A lot of those experiments fall victim to the psychological wounds and shadows that come in with the founders. Some of them, though, last over time and have something really important to offer. Ultimately, though, we need to transform the places where we already live, not just create eco-villages. And that is challenging because the infrastructure, the economic infrastructure, even the physical infrastructure is almost designed to keep us separate.
Yeah.
And so we have millions upon millions of people whose consciousness really has moved on, who really desire to live in a much, much different way. But the social and physical environment pulls them back into the old story.
Which is part of the reason why I think often what happens when people open up is they inevitably move towards those eco-societies or kind of communities where they feel they can be more connected. And in a sense, it's kind of a shame. It's good for them because they're not being so challenged by the old structure, but then they're taking those new ideas away from the old structure.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes that's the real power to change, I guess, is then returning to those structures and bringing that insight and that wisdom.
And I think, so if you plug into one of those places, spend some time there in one of these communities, enough time that something crystallizes in you that cannot be destroyed when you go back into the old, then you become a magnet for new structures to emerge, in the old world.
Yes.
And that's starting to happen now.
Yeah.
And also what's happening is that enough of us are having these experiences, these glimpses of the future, these experiential glimpses of what life could be, of what the world could be. And you know it when you have it, you know, it's like, for me, the feeling is this can't be some trick of the universe that I'm shown this only to have it be taken away again. I must be shown this as like a promise of what's possible. And then, yeah, you know, I go back to the environment that conditions me, and that certainty becomes just a memory.
You discover
But-
how far you really have come if you've got, because you get re-challenged, right?
Right, because all the old habits that my whole environment reinforces pull me back. And they make what I experienced as real, they make it seem unreal. You know, I was just imagining things. It couldn't have been that compelling. So I doubt, but now what's happening, what's really changing today is that we have those experiences. We're immersed in, I mean, it could be a transformational music festival even. It could be, you know, a spiritual retreat. It could be just a peak experience that you have. And you go back then after that, and enough other people are also having those experiences that instead of getting pulled back into the old, there's now enough people to hold us in at least a bit of the new story. So it's like you know, coming up for air, like you get sucked under, and then you come up again into the sunlit realm, and you get sucked under again, and then you come up for air, and there's somebody else who's also come up for air, and you hold on to each other, and then you both get sucked down together. Then you come up again for air, and there's 4 other people,
Right.
and now we're holding on to each other, and no longer being pulled into that old reality, but holding each other in the new.
Nice.
Yeah.
Nice. So I think we'll go for another 10, 15 minutes or so. There's a
Sure.
few more just questions that some might be, this one might just be a yes or a no answer, but have you ever, it's from Corey Maxer, have you ever tried to reach out to political figures to get them thinking about some sacred economic principles or some of your, you know, broader teaching? Bernie Sanders comes to mind as someone who may be so bold. You probably get asked this question a bit right now. It's kind of big in the news.
There's lots of smart guys with their, you know, world-changing idea and their blueprint for a better society that are reaching out to Bernie Sanders.
Yeah, I imagine.
No, I don't reach out to people in power. It's not that I would ignore them if they reached out to me.
Right, it's a different way
But
to cover it.
I don't think that, for me, I mean, some people have a gift for working the halls of power. I'm not one of those people. And the idea that, like, I'm also very resistant to the idea that change will happen when we finally convince Bernie Sanders or Jeremy Corbyn or Donald Trump.
It's a good local reference. Well done. Following the British news.
Yeah, I mean, whoever it is, you know, the change will come when we finally convince the person with power of our ideas. Because guess what? The people with power don't actually have power. Not as much as we think they have.
Yeah.
No matter what Bernie Sanders is convinced of, if he gets into office, he's going to be helpless to do anything much different than his predecessor did, because it's built into the job description. I've had these conversations with, I mean, occasionally I do intersect with somebody in a position of power. And I remember one time I was having lunch with some members of parliament in South Africa. And they were like, yeah, Charles, we totally agree with everything you're saying. But there's no way that we could bring any of this into public policy. And they listed all the reasons: the opposition, the party leadership, the interest groups, the public opinion, you know, the bureaucracy, you know, all of these things made them essentially feel helpless. They felt like pawns of larger forces. The same thing is true of many, many very wealthy people. People who, I talked to someone recently who's heir to hundreds of millions of dollars, but what she can do is highly limited by her family office. You know, this one of these wealthy families, you know, like what are the other people in the family going to think? And weirdly enough, this is one of those situations where the whole is less than the sum of the parts, not more, but less. Everybody individually in that family office might want to be more audacious, but when they get together, they become more conservative.
Right.
So basically, what's happened? What we part of our theory of change in the old story involves a conception of power that ultimately means how much force do you have at your disposal. If you have lots of money, then you can, or lots of political power, you can make things happen. So we should appeal to those people to make change happen. But as we begin to discard that theory of change, we realize that everybody is equally powerful,
Right.
because none of us are separate from all that is. So every action that we take, every choice that we make has cosmic significance. And we may not know how that choice will end up impacting the future. Maybe your choice to sit with your grandmother as she's dying has an impact 400 years from now. Who knows by what mysterious chain of cause and effect it ends up altering reality, whereas, you know, President Obama's decision to cancel the Keystone XL pipeline or something like that might have been almost an inevitability. And because a lot of these people in power, their leeway, if they deviate more than a little bit from their job description as a functionary of the system, they are quickly eliminated. We saw this with Syriza in Greece, with Varoufakis, the finance minister. You know, like he refused to play by the rules. He said things that were unsayable. Like, he famously, you know, tried to point out to this meeting of you know, European finance officials that austerity is futile and has no economic justification. And he, you know, had his position paper, and he said, "Please tell me your argument to the contrary." And he said their response was as if I broke out singing the Swedish national anthem. Like it was as if I said something so inappropriate that it couldn't even be heard.
Yeah.
You know, he was ousted. So, you know, you find all the time, like left-wing politicians, when they get into power, they end up doing the same thing as everybody else. Is that because they're turncoats, or is it because they have almost no choice? So, long story short, just going to wrap it up. I don't spend a lot of time trying to persuade the people in power of my ideas. I think that when they change their minds, that will be as a barometer of a collective shift of consciousness.
Yes, and of course it's also appealing to get into a kind of relationship with power where it's like a child to parent, like you're disappointing me, you're letting me down, rather than recognizing we have our own capacity to stand up and be our own voice and our own, you know, source of change. Which brings us on to a question from Ben, which is he'd like to hear you talk about death. And I wondered if, you know, maybe we could also open that to death as transition and change, and what your thoughts are, you know, either individually or on a more kind of collective, given that we're clearly heading towards some pretty significant transition of some sort.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's not at all a new observation that our society tries to hide death, denies death. What could I say that's a little bit new about it? Death is a much more frightening concept for the separate self than it is for the connected self, for the interbeing self, the interexistent self. Because if you are nothing but an ego encased in flesh, or a mind encased in flesh, then death is the death of all that you are. But if you understand yourself as a nexus of relationship and a mirror of everything else in the universe, then there's really not a whole lot that's dying. Not the important part. I could say more about it, but I think that you'll probably have people on your show who are, more qualified to, who've done deep spiritual inquiry or meditation. Yeah, I mean, if the questioner were here, we could probably go into a dialogue about it, because I'm not sure what he's really thinking.
Where the orientation is, yeah.
Yeah.
So, final two questions. I want to come on to in a minute. There's some questions around the online course that's kind of, I know you're currently kind of putting the word out for. But also just a final question from Victoria. I'm not going to read out the whole question, but she wanted you to speak a bit about the role of intuition in connecting us with Source and as a sacred tool. And I think what she's curious about is, how do we invite and support more of that?
I mean, I think it's kind of what I was saying before, that intuition requires letting go of what you think you know already.
Right.
Because then something from outside can come in, something from outside what you could conventionally, ordinarily know. So you got to create space for that.
Right. Something new can happen. Yeah.
Yeah. And I guess part of that is, again, trusting in an intelligence outside yourself. Because if you don't have that trust, then you're probably likely to discard whatever information is coming in intuitively. Because how could I know that? But I find in my life, often when I say something is intuition, often it's fear dressed up as intuition. So I guess, I'm still learning to distinguish what's intuition, and because intuition's become kind of this trendy thing, like I'm a very intuitive person, I listen to my intuition, we should all listen to our intuition.
It's often, I've heard my intuition, and therefore I'm right, and you have to listen to it, right?
Right. Yeah, it can also become a way to abort any conversation.
Right.
That's
Exactly.
Happening. It's like a trump card.
It's a new form of I'm right and you're wrong. It's just my intuition.
My intuition is saying it. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. So yeah, it definitely shouldn't be used as a rhetorical bludgeon.
That's great. I like that. I like that. So, I mean, you touched on it kind of a few times, and obviously it's such a huge topic, this whole thing around masculinity. And maybe, and also actually maybe it's a good place just to show how, part of how you found a way to live some of these ideas of what we've been talking about and the gift economy. Like, I saw some bits on your Facebook page around some of your story around how people can choose how they can pay, and he rolls his eyes. You don't have to ask the question if you don't want to, but I just wanted to create some space, and there has been some interest online as well. People just curious. You can either answer on that level, or even just people want to have an experience to go a bit deeper into some of your ideas, how they could do that.
Well, yeah. So that I've been experimenting with non-traditional business models. So I've done many things, and so for this online course, I, set a price that I thought was, a fair market price for this kind of thing, and then I said, and you could choose that or half scholarship, 3/4 scholarship, full scholarship, and you don't have to justify it or anything. You just choose whatever feels right to you.
It's an honor kind of thing, yeah.
Yeah, but I'm realizing that I was almost like, there's this whole internet marketing model, where you create courses and you sign people up, and then you upsell them to the exclusive platinum course, and then there's this whole thing, and
diamond, platinum, gold versions.
Yeah, and it's like, I'm repelled by that, but it's almost like I was trying to do that without doing that.
Right.
And right now I'm just like, screw it. I'm just gonna not even bother, and just probably I'm going to just say, pay whatever you want. If you don't want to pay anything, that's fine too.
Yeah.
Really, you know, a core principle of the gift is that the recipient decides
Right.
what to give in response.
Right.
What complicates that, though, is that typically there's a social environment that cues you into what is appropriate.
Mm.
Like you're not making this choice of what do I give in return in a vacuum.
Mm.
So when I offer something by gift, people don't understand that. They may not have that cue or that, you know, that guidance, like what would be appropriate.
Mm.
So there's no like simple way out of that. And, you know, sometimes people say, well, Charles, if you're even suggesting a price or hoping for something, then it's not really in the gift because a real gift expects no return. Is that actually true though? Like, do we really know what a gift is?
Right.
In traditional societies, you don't compel a certain return,
Yes.
but there is an expectation
Yes.
of return because that's what you've seen your whole life.
Right.
You know, there's a culture of gift. We don't have that very much. So that's why I say I'm experimenting with it. I'm wanting to in this vacuum, you know, how do we reestablish a culture of gift? So, you know, yeah, and like maybe sometimes my habits of ego and greed color the way that I make these offerings. I'm not Mr. Gift, you know. I'm in an inquiry
Right.
about it, and just like this course is an inquiry into masculinity. I'm not like saying, okay, I figured it out, and I'm going to offer it to you as a product. A product? No, I don't know that. I'm the most I can say is that I'm a talented inquirer.
That's beautiful.
Yeah,
I really like that.
yeah.
I really like that. You know, it's interesting. I'll say a couple of words. It's interesting. A few friends of mine are teachers in the Buddhist tradition, and there they have a concept of dana, which is that, you know, the teaching is offered for free, and then you contribute towards a teacher. And you know, having worked a lot with different spiritual teachers through Conscious 2 and different kind of parts of my life, and one of the things that I see is how much actually people say, oh, it would be amazing to sit there and teach and how wonderful. And they don't see all the work that goes on behind the scenes, the kind of endless airports and traveling and being away from family. And kind of sometimes, you know, you turn up and, you know, you get supported really well, and other times you don't. And just, I feel a kind of sincerity around supporting teachers and supporting people doing great things. And so if people are kind of, you know, exploring doing the course, to not just kind of price it in terms of what it's worth to them, but also what's it worth to them to have people like you, which are sharing and offering teaching that has a real value for the world, in wanting to support that. I think that to me feels very important.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know if just in closing, if you want to, just because we haven't really touched on it, a few words about the actual format of the course. Like you mentioned, it's an online course. It's an
online course. Yeah, with kind of guest presenters who I record a conversation with. I've done 4 so far, and they're like beyond what I expected. Like I've learned a huge amount through these. And then they're broadcast every couple of weeks, and then in between there's a live session with me and the guest, where, you know, people can ask questions and whatever's come up and there's forums, online forums in between. People can talk about stuff. So it's, you know, got some interactivity. And I have a feeling it's going to take on a life of its own and go places that's another reason I can't offer it as a course so much as maybe more of a learning journey or an inquiry, because I really don't know where it's going to go. And if I say that I did and try to make it go there, it would be less than it could be.
Right. Nice. And if people want to find out more, they go to your website, or you have a particular site for the
There's a site for the course. I think it's...
I bet you go on your Facebook page to find it.
I think it's thesacredmasculine.net. My main website's charleseisenstein.net. .net.
.net, yeah. And is there a
Yeah.
link off there?
Probably.
I love it.
Yeah.
Well, let me see if I can dig it out quickly.
I mean, there's people who are, I have, a small team that helps me do these things.
Yeah, I'll find it for you. Whilst I'm doing that, I want to say a huge thank you, Charles, to your time and your kind of exploration. It feels, for me, it's always really exciting to have these kind of dialogues and explorations. It's very rich, and I think people have definitely felt very engaged watching it at home. So thank you so much. And I also want to say thank you very much to you guys for being here as well and sharing yourselves and bringing your questions. It's kind of really helps bring it alive as well. And whilst I'm still looking for the, here we go.
I think charleseisenstein.net.
.net, yeah, that's the best place to go to.
Yeah.
I think, yeah. I found it, thesacredmasculine.net.
Okay.
There we go. And thank you guys very much for watching. If you enjoyed tonight's event and you want to watch the replay or you want to access many of the other events we've done here on Conscious 2, then you can look into becoming a premium member, which gives you access to everything we've done in the library. I think nearly now 200 hours of inquiries, workshops, courses, and that kind of thing. Charles, thank you so much. And thank you guys for watching. Hopefully you'll join us again very soon here on Conscious 2.